Good evening, everybody. My name's Elisa Barwick and I'm a member of the National Executive Committee of the Citizens Electoral Council, and I'll be tonight's moderator. I'd like to welcome you all to the first national webcast of the Citizens Electoral Council. We are a federally registered political party, and tonight will be hopefully the first of many of these live addresses to the nation. Just to mention the format for this evening, we will have an hour presentation or so up first, and that will be followed by questions. We already have numerous questions that have come in, but for anybody who is watching over the internet, I'd like to invite you to submit questions, which you can do at our website. You'll see the button on the top of the page. Also, if anybody has mobile phones, please put them to silent. Now, we are meeting tonight truly at a moment of opportunity, but also of great peril for the world. But what will absolutely be, either way, a moment of decision for Australia and for our future. So with that said, I'd like to introduce to you Craig Isherwood. Craig is one of the founders of the CEC and our National Secretary. Craig?
Thanks, Elisa. Tonight I want to speak to you about a new fundamental mission for our country, Australia, which will define our nation for decades and even centuries to come. But that mission, that new mission, can only be understood when placed in the present global strategic context. One which our news media, our Prime Minister, our MPs and other so-called authorities have all been lying their heads off about. The reality is that the world's financial and physical economy is now plunging into a far worse crisis than the 14th century New Dark Age. Back then, looting by Venice-centred financiers, like London Wall Street looting of today, caused the collapse of Europe and killed 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of Europe through the plague, through famine, and through chaotic violence and related causes. Under the present policies of globalisation and free trade, make no mistake, there will be no recovery. Never. Not in a million years, unless we institute a dramatic shift in the present world strategic geometry, and do that very soon, within weeks and months. The reality is that the world today is controlled by a monetary system. It's one centred in the City of London with branch offices in Wall Street and other financial centres. This monetary system is based on looting the physical economy through outright usury, speculation, globalisation, privatisation and free trade. And this is the British Empire. It still exists, although today it doesn't rule so much by redcoats and gunboats. It rules more by monetary and ideological control, and it is still run by the Queen and her murderous cadaver of a husband, Prince Philip. It is the collapse of this London-centred system which is plunging all the rest of us into hell, unless we do something about it. This notion of a world-ruling dictatorial imperial money power is not new to us Australians. In fact, the old ALP was founded precisely in the struggle against what it called the money power. One of the great leaders of the old ALP was Frank Anstey, the man about whom John Curtin, as Prime Minister, said, "Of all the men who have influenced me, he who influenced me the most." Anstey and he reflected the majority sentiment in old Labor, wrote in his 1921 book, The Money Power, quote, "Australia is a mere appendage of financial London, without distinct economic existence. London is, so far, the web centre of international finance. In London are assembled the actual chiefs or the representatives of the great financial houses of the world. The money power is something more than capitalism. These men constitute the financial oligarchy. No nation can be really free where this financial oligarchy is permitted to hold dominion, and no democracy can be aught but a name that does not shake it from its throne." Throughout our history, all of our great struggles have proceeded from this fight, to free ourselves from that money power. This was a great cause to which all true leaders of old Labor, notably John Curtin and Ben Chifley, were committed. So what do we do now? How do we break this stranglehold of British imperial monetarism? The American physical economist and statesman, my friend Lyndon LaRouche, whom I've known and worked with for almost 20 years now, has for decades been proposing pathways out of this disaster. And he now has a battle plan to defeat the British Empire and the Queen. It's called the Four Powers Alliance. It's very simple in principle, that the United States, Russia, China and India, who together represent a huge section of the world's population and a great deal of raw physical power, join together to initiate an entirely new kind of world financial system, a credit system, to replace the Queen's monetary system. I'll elaborate a bit more about that later, but simply put, a credit system is what America was founded on in the first place in a war against the British system of monetarist looting, which at that time tried to strangle the young American colonies in the cradle, including using free trade to wreck all her young industries. A credit system, as founder of our original Commonwealth Bank, King O'Malley, intended, is based on government-controlled national banking for the public good. That is, for the expansion of the physical economy as opposed to privately controlled so-called central banking, which only benefits the vultures of London and Wall Street. So dump free trade, dump globalisation, and all that goes with this in favour of these four powers establishing a new credit international system of perfectly sovereign nation-states, each of which controls its own sovereign credit system for the public good. And the first steps towards this new credit system were initiated with crucial input from Mr. LaRouche himself, input going back many years, but in particular just recently in discussions with government leaders at an international conference in early October at Rhodes, Greece, regarding Russia-China collaboration. The upshot of all this was a remarkable set of agreements struck between Russia and China in September and October. In September, Russian President Medvedev and Chinese President Hu Jintao approved a comprehensive Russia-China 2018 cooperation program. And this was to build 205 joint projects in the Russian Far East, Siberia and northeast China. Then in mid-October, immediately on the heels of the Rhodes Conference, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin and Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao signed 12 other major agreements in the energy sphere, not only oil and gas, but also the development of advanced generations of nuclear power. These are bilateral development programs which Prime Minister Putin emphasised involved cooperation in high technologies and trade in highly processed products. Nearly 24 other agreements were signed by Russian and Chinese companies at that time. Russia has some of the richest mineral resources in the world in Siberia, and the Russian Far East has only 25 or so million citizens living in it, in that whole vast region. So China is going to help develop that area, investing some almost $1 trillion it holds, which will give real value to those dollars, which are otherwise fast becoming worthless. These are sovereign nation states collaborating, using each other's respective strengths to build the physical economy of each nation for the public good. And because of their size and power, you see there the seed crystal of a new world alignment, if continued. If the US and India join, this will represent a historic shift from an Atlantic-centred world, one dominated by the British Empire through London and Wall Street, to a new Pacific-centred world which will break the back of the British Empire forever. Let me also report to you on two other crucial battlefronts against this British imperial system of monetarism, one which involves Australia itself. The first front is in the US, where if the US is going to help initiate this Four Powers Agreement, as it absolutely must if the whole thing is going to succeed, then the present policies of this narcissistic nutcase, President Barack Obama, must be overthrown, because he is nothing but a bow and scrape toady of the British Queen, including adopting her genocidal policies of so-called healthcare and carbon trading. Though the major media has blacked it out, as it does all important news, a political mass strike has erupted in the United States in August, when hundreds of thousands, even millions of Americans packed town hall meetings with their congressmen and held huge demonstrations around the country, including a huge one in Washington, D.C. The lead issue was Obama's planned genocidal healthcare cuts, but the ferment was far deeper. Like Australia, the US population has been ravaged by this present economic collapse, with mass home foreclosures and 30% actual unemployment. They've seen mass cuts in federal and state provided social and other services, since all 50 US states are now hopelessly bankrupt, such that their state legislators are in constant crisis session to enact even more deadly cuts as their revenue stream disappears along with their farms and industry. Meanwhile, Obama has poured some $23 trillion into bailing out Wall Street and the City of London, with no benefit whatsoever to the average American. So this unique phenomenon of a mass strike has broken out in America. It's a totally different social dynamic than that which rules in so-called normal times. Beginning in August, the American people have told their congressmen in increasingly strident tones, "Look you, Jack, you listen to us for a change. We're Americans. You've got no right to destroy us." And they meant it. If you've seen any of these town hall meetings on the internet, which you can still find, you know that this is a radically different process than business as usual. So this mass strike, whose intellectual leadership is Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Youth Movement, is deepening by the day and holds the real potential to overthrow one way or another Obama and his Wall Street and London bankers. Perhaps you've seen this poster originated by LaRouche to portray Obama's literal copy of Hitler's murderous so-called healthcare policy from 1939, exterminating so-called useless eaters, which is everywhere. This poster is everywhere in these meetings and demonstrations. Either Obama changes his policy or gets impeached and thrown out of office. His popularity now is now plunging at probably the fastest rate in history for a US president. Now, a second front in this war against the British monetarist empire has erupted against the global warming issue, as we've just seen here in Australia. There is no such thing as man-made global warming. It's a total lie, one made up by Prince Philip and his World Wildlife Fund to enforce a dictatorship over what remains of farming and industry worldwide, to shut them down and to cut the world's population down from a present 6.7 billion people down to 2 billion or less. This global warming scam is a plot for global genocide led by the British Crown. Prince Philip has repeatedly said that he wants to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to help solve the world population problem. And fittingly enough, the guy who co-founded his World Wildlife Fund back in 1963 was the now deceased Dutch Prince Bernhard, a proud former member of Hitler's Nazi Party. So as you might expect, the Queen demanded draconian measures to stop the non-existent global warming as the main item at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Trinidad and Tobago on the 27th of November, beginning with her opening address. She instructed her subjects in the 53 nations of the Commonwealth to adopt mandatory restrictions on carbon emissions. And Kevin Rudd helped to write the main document for it. Her Imperial Majesty intended the Chogga meeting as a warm-up for the United Nations Copenhagen Climate Conference, now underway, to pass dictatorial emissions policy. Toward that goal, her fruity son Prince Charles will keynote the conference second week, when some 100 world leaders are expected to show up. Meanwhile, you probably heard that the major theoretical centre pushing global warming, the Climate Research Unit of East Anglia, University in Britain, has been caught red-handed falsifying the data, suppressing the evidence that the world's temperature has actually been dropping for the last decade, and generally lying its head off. So who funds this oh so prestigious British university? Prince Philip's World Wildlife Fund. And also the British government and other major Anglo-Dutch cartels such as Royal Dutch Shell and British Petroleum, the same crowd which funds the World Wildlife Fund itself. Now let's look at what's happening here in Australia last week, particularly in that stunning defeat in Parliament of the global warming-derived scam known as the Emissions Trading Scheme, the ETS, because it reflects the same kind of mass strike process which has broken out in the US against Obama and the US Congress over healthcare. It's really beautiful, particularly when you look at all the ironies of it. Here is a ploy by the British Crown and the City of London for a global dictatorship and genocide under the cover of stopping so-called carbon emissions. And their toady, Kevin Rudd, has been a world leader in this, bringing that jerk and liar Fat Al Gore to Australia to help him sell this swindle. This is the same Al Gore whose personal mansion in Tennessee, complete with a huge heated swimming pool, eats up enough electricity to power an African nation for an entire year, and who was a partner in a London-based hedge fund selling emission trading rights. So the ETS fraud comes up in Parliament, and what happens? Well, you actually have to step back a couple of years to understand this. Due to all the greenie brainwashing in this country over a long, long time, in 2007, public opinion polls showed that 68% of Australians then favoured urgent action to stop climate change. So myself, my associates, and in the CEC and the LaRouche Youth Movement went to work. We first produced 500,000 copies of this special edition of our New Citizen newspaper in 2007. Simple. Global warming is a fraud. We saturated the country with it, including the 5th World Conference of Science Journalists being held at the Melbourne Hyatt Hotel. Now, the upheaval around that, including the uproar over that intervention, even in the so-called major media, forced the airing of the UK Channel 4 documentary, The Great Global Warming Swindle, on national television here. Now, we continue to hammer both the scientific fraud and genocidal agenda behind global warming in our regular email press releases, which have a very wide circulation across Australia. The global warming issue also determined the CEC's Senate preferences in November 2007 federal election, when we announced that, in a press release, that, quote, the CEC would hold their noses and preference the Liberal Party, because at least an outspoken faction of the Liberal Party had exposed global warming for the utter fraud that it was, end quote. In May 2008, we mobilised Australia to respond to the world food crisis and expose the ethanol fraud looting precious food production in favour of so-called renewable energy. Radical Greens like Clive Hamilton and John Quiggin started to denounce the CEC and Arouche as leading the anti-global warming camp. This year, we repeatedly exposed the financial fraud behind carbon trading. The LaRouche youth movement intervened at Al Gore's tin-rattling breakfast with Australia's superannuation industry at Docklands in Melbourne in June, and in August we printed and distributed 350,000 copies of our New Citizen newspaper entitled Carbon Trading is Hitler-Style Genocide. All of this emboldened a number of leading scientists to speak out as well, led by our dear friend, the now deceased Lance Endersby, one of Australia's foremost engineers in a distinguished career going back to his role in the post-war years building the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. But here's the fun part. You all know, going into this fight, the Liberal Party was headed by Malcolm Turnbull, a former merchant banker for Goldman Sachs, the firm which has played a key role in looting and destroying the world economy. Reflecting general Liberal Party sentiment, which in turn reflected the changes that we in the CEC and LIM had set in motion in the general population, Turnbull was opposed to this fraud. At least he argued that there shouldn't be any big rush on it, and that any final decision should be deferred until after the Copenhagen conference. That is, until old Malcolm returned from a 2-week visit to London. Then he suddenly demanded that the Libs support the immediate passage of the ETS. But when Turnbull tried to ram this through the Liberal Party, he ran into the same buzzsaw now dismantling Obama in the US. A brewing mass strike of an Australian population sick to death of the personal ravages to themselves, to their friends and families, and to almost everybody else they know, of the agony and devastation wrought by free trade, globalisation, privatisation and so on. As in America with healthcare, the ETS is only the tip of the iceberg, and these icebergs ain't melting. Believe you me, at least no more than usual. So because of the mass strike and various internet polls and other polls taken on the ETS issue which showed overwhelming opposition to it in the population, and particularly in the Libs' own base, they knew that they would likely disappear as a party if they did what Turnbull wanted and did a dirty deal with Rudd to pass it. So what happened? The raving monarchist, Tony Abbott, who had just a few months before said that the ETS should be passed so as to remove it as a potential election issue, all of a sudden leads the charge against the issue which the Queen herself demanded be enacted. Let's have no illusions about Tony Abbott as some hero of the people, however. Tony Abbott, like Turnbull, was a Rhodes Scholar, trained at Oxford with scholarships established by Cecil Rhodes and the British Imperial Round Table crowd back in the 19th century to train the elites of the colonies in self-rule, but self-rule according to British imperial dictates. That is, the old empire, but in its new guise of self-rule, the so-called Commonwealth Group of Nations. In fact, in the so-called debate over the Republic back in the 1990s, Abbott headed the Australians for a constitutional monarchy, while merchant banker Turnbull headed the other side, the Australian Republican movement. Of course, Turnbull and his crowd who were pushing a so-called republic were all toadies for Her Majesty, led by members of her Privy Council, beginning with the chairman of the whole effort, Privy Councillor and former Governor-General Sir Ninian Stevens. And it was all financed by the major corporations, beginning with Rio Tinto, in which the Queen is the single largest stockholder, an AMP Society insurance giant, the Commonwealth Bank, and similar pillars of the financial oligarchy. These great Republicans. Australia smelled that this so-called republic, particularly without a popularly elected president, was a fraud, and decisively voted it down. So we have these recent highly optimistic developments with the Russian and Chinese deals, and the mass strike process erupting in both the United States and Australia, shaking up and threatening to overturn the established order of British monetarism. And all the while, that monetarist imperial order is disintegrating as the global financial collapse accelerates, as it just has with the bankruptcy of Dubai, which is the dirty money capital of the British Empire, in particular for all the dope money involving Afghanistan. As of 2007, Afghanistan produced an astounding 8,200 tonnes of opium, accounting for 93% of the world's opium and heroin supply, with an estimated street value of between $400 and $500 billion. Dubai is now what Hong Kong was until China took it over on the 1st of July 1997, the centre of the world's drug traffic, which was run by the British East India Company for the 19th and much of the 20th century, when, according to various historians and a famous study conducted by Mr. LaRouche's associates, drugs were often the single largest commodity in world trade. Now, let me explain at this point the process of the financial collapse in more detail, because this will also help us understand the way out of this mess. Here we have to look at a pedagogy first developed by Mr. LaRouche in 1996 called the triple curve function, which I'll explain in a moment, but I have to do a little bit of history first. Since the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which some historians have called the First World War, when the British defeated the French and grabbed Canada and most of India from the French, the world has been dominated by the British Empire. The world has been dominated by the British Empire, centred in the city of London. This was not an empire of the British people, but of a private company, the British East India Company, which had the largest fleet and largest army in the world at the time, much larger than the nation of Britain itself. When the East India Company went bankrupt in the middle of the 19th century for various reasons, including by President Abraham Lincoln's defeat of the British-backed slave-owning Confederacy, which sold all their slave-grown cotton to Britain, the empire became centred around the British Crown itself. You probably remember from school that Queen Victoria's Prime Minister, Disraeli, granted her personal control over the nation of India. So this empire has been run by the Crown at the apex of the City of London, and the world financial empire run out of London. Now, under this system of financial empire, money itself is given a value. It has a price, and therefore the control of money through this private financial cartel controls nations. They control you, because this is usury. This triple curve depicts an economy dominated by a monetary system. And for most of European history, and for several thousands of years before that, most of the world has been ruled, most of the time, by empires. And the core of these empires, both historically and still today, are these monetary systems. So monetary systems have three interrelated curves. Firstly, the top curve, it represents financial aggregates, the use of money, but for the purchase and sale of actual goods and services, the useful aspects of the economy. The second curve, the yellow one, represents the monetary aggregates, money that is used for the sale of money, for money and by money. Everything is money, money, money. Wealth is money. The third curve represents actual physical economic production, real production. These are the three factors which combine together to function as a monetarist economy. And understanding this and the interrelationship among these three curves is the method by which Mr. LaRouche has been the most successful economic forecaster in the world over the last 50 years. Now, over this past decade, since 1996, as the bottom curve, that is the physical production curve, continued to collapse, the financial oligarchy started printing money through their privately owned central banks to bail out the system. In the year 2000, Mr. LaRouche updated his triple curve to show a critical point of instability in which the rate of growth of the emission of monetary aggregates, that is the printing of money, overtook the rate of growth of the financial aggregates, and hyperinflation started to take off, which you have seen already for some time now in the skyrocketing price of oil and many other commodities such as fertiliser, food and so on. Then, in an international webcast on the 25th of July 2007, LaRouche delivered his best-known recent forecast where he warned that we were heading immediately into a world financial breakdown crisis. 3 days later, that crisis exploded with the so-called subprime mortgage crisis, the collapse of Bear Stearns Investment Bank, and many similar things, a collapse which is still ongoing now and becoming worse by the day.
This occurs at a time where the world monetary financial system is actually now currently in the process of disintegrating. Nothing mysterious about this. Nothing mysterious about this. I've talked about it for some time. It's been in progress. It's not abating. What's listed as stock values and market values in the financial markets internationally is bunk. These are purely fictitious beliefs. There's no truth to it. The fakery is enormous. There is no possibility of a non-collapse of the present financial system. None. It's finished now. The present financial system cannot continue to exist under any circumstances, under any presidency, under any leadership, or any leadership of nations. Only a fundamental and sudden change in the world monetary financial system will prevent a general, immediate, chain reaction type of collapse. At what speed we don't know, but it will go on and it will be unstoppable. And the longer it goes on before coming to an end, the worse things will get.
So immediately in August and September of that year, LaRouche proposed new legislation to solve the crisis, his Homeowners and Bank Protection Act. It was designed to freeze all mortgage foreclosures and put the entire US financial system through bankruptcy reorganisation. To shift from a monetarist-dominated economy, which was the yellow curve, top curve, to a new credit system to foster the development of real physical economy, the bottom curve. His Homeowners and Bank Protection Act would have solved the crisis then, and it did gain extensive backing from city councillors as a whole, state legislators and many state governments in the US. However, it was vigorously opposed by British and Wall Street stooges like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Barney Frank, the Chairman of the House Finance Committee. Consequently, the USA and the world moved into the next stage of the breakdown crisis, in which entire nations are starting to default, just like Dubai did in late November. Here in Australia, the CEC led a major organising drive throughout late 2007 and 2008 for an Australian version of LaRouche's legislation. This proposal was endorsed by some entire local councils and hundreds of individual councillors, but was bitterly opposed by Kevin 007 and by our major banks. Returning to the triple curve, in 2008, Mr. LaRouche updated it to reflect the fact that the financial aggregates curve, representing transactions in the economy tied to real goods and services, turned sharply downwards, which produced further instability. So to try and keep this monetary system alive for just a bit longer, London and Wall Street instructed President Obama to pump $23 trillion into the US and world banking systems. This has now brought the world to the very brink of a hyperinflationary collapse like that of Weimar Germany in 1923. Because of that astronomical bailout, the kind of financial reorganisation Mr. LaRouche proposed in 2007 is no longer possible. The crisis is just too advanced. What is required now is a wholesale reorganisation of the entire world's economy, so that each nation functions with a credit system instead of an imperialist-dominated monetary system. In this new healthy world economy of the type implied by the recent Russia-China development projects, there will no longer be three curves, but only two. The monetary curve will be eliminated. Yes, we will still have money for everyday use, but it will be entirely subordinated to the other two curves rather than an entity in and of itself. Thus, you will only have two curves rather than money dictating everything. Therefore, as of now, meaning in the immediate weeks and months ahead, we have to replace the entire world's financial and monetary system into bankruptcy reorganisation, to literally quarantine and then write off the trillions of dollars of unpayable speculative debt. The standard for doing this is best exemplified by the Glass-Steagall Act, which President Franklin Roosevelt passed in 1933 to rein in the vultures of Wall Street so that he could organise a recovery for the US physical economy to pull the US and the world out of the Great Depression. Glass-Steagall forbade commercial banks from engaging in the kind of wild Wall Street and London-type speculations in stocks and bonds, mortgages, derivatives, and all other forms of speculation which have caused the present crisis and which caused the Great Depression back then. Legitimate debt that has claims to the underlying physical productive processes of the economies will be preserved on the books of the banks. But an estimated $1 quadrillion in speculative instruments will simply be written off. Sovereign national governments will then create huge masses of new credit to fund large-scale infrastructure and other development projects to start rebuilding national economies. Here in Australia, for a brief period from 1911 to 1923, when Denison Miller chaired the original Commonwealth Bank along the principles outlined by its founder, King O'Malley, our Australian economy tended to function that way. It's how we financed our transcontinental railroad, for instance, which King O'Malley also directed as Home Minister in the Andrew Fisher Labor government. But we as a nation were not founded on a sovereign credit system. Only the United States, of all nations in history, was actually founded that way. By Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution, only the federal government has the right to issue and control credit and money. This system was first established by the first US Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who had been General George Washington's aide-de-camp during the American Revolution against the British. When King O'Malley founded the Commonwealth Bank in 1911, he proclaimed in Parliament, "I am the Hamilton of Australia." He was the greatest financial man who ever walked the earth, and his plans have never been improved upon. By contrast with this American credit system, let us look at our Australian monetary system. At first glance, Part 5 of our Constitution, entitled Powers of the Parliament, seems to specify a national credit system. There, Section 51 grants the Parliament control over, quote, currency, coinage and legal tender, unquote, and control over, quote, banking other than state banking, also state banking beyond the limits of the state concerned, the incorporation of banks and the issue of paper money, end quote. However, all of this is wiped out by Section 56, which gives the Queen's Governor-General the right to veto any bill whatsoever, and then says Section 58, which, in the unlikely case that the Governor-General might act independently of the Crown, specifies that the Queen has the final word on all Australian legislation, and that still is the case today, no matter what nonsense you might have heard to the contrary. And then you've got the Banking Act of 1959 and the Reserve Bank Act of 1959 also, which wiped out any remaining control over national currency or finances by the Commonwealth Bank in favour of the new privately directed Reserve Bank. Now, because they're based upon using credit to develop the national physical economies of both countries, the large-scale deals recently struck between Russia and China open the door, potentially at least, to a world credit system. They clearly also foreshadow the shift of the centre of the world economic and political power to the Pacific, and therefore have sweeping implications for Australia. And Mr LaRouche has been talking quite a bit about Australia of late, including in a pre-recorded video presentation to a conference in Moscow on December the 3rd at the Russian Anti-Globalist Resistance and the Academy of Geopolitical Studies, and also in an international webcast the same day. In the latter, in the webcast, he sketched some of the great infrastructure projects needed for both the US and for the world, including high-speed rail lines across the Bering Strait between the Russian Far East and Alaska in the US. This would unite the United States, Russia, Europe, Asia and Africa into a single rail grid everywhere but Australia, something we'll have to solve before too long. In his December 3rd webcast, LaRouche emphasised the importance of Australia's role.
We can do that. We can unite this mega planet, or this mega continent, composed of Africa, the Americas, and Eurasia. And the Australians are eager to cooperate, because Australia has a great mass of such things as uranium and thorium, which are the fine ingredients of nuclear power these days. So therefore, Australia will be invited to contribute its development of its relevant industries in this large area they have for themselves as a nation, and they will have a future in the world by playing this kind of role of cooperation as Australia with Asia in particular.
So Australia can unite with this new dynamic of a four powers alliance, or it can continue in its present role as a ruined beachhead in Asia for the British Empire, an empire now renamed the Commonwealth for public relations purposes. This present role of Australia under Kevin Rudd, as also under Howard and under Hawke and Keating before, was spelled out most clearly in a 1995 report by the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, the RIIA, formerly known as the British Imperial Roundtable Organisation, founded by Cecil Rhodes, the Crown and the Rothschilds and other private financiers back in the 1890s. The RIIA report was entitled "The Economic Opportunities for Britain and the Commonwealth," and it is still British policy today. The report argued that Britain should use its extensive cultural and business networks of the Commonwealth almost exactly as the Queen did in opening the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Trinidad and Tobago on the 27th of November, as a launching pad to penetrate every corner of the globe. Although Her Imperial Majesty was a bit discreet on the purpose behind this new world-dominating Commonwealth, the RIIA report spelled it out clearly: to loot every nation it could reach through the methods of deregulation, privatisation and free trade. The biggest source of wealth is Asia. Therefore, the report stated Britain should turn from a preoccupation with Europe toward the vast riches of the Asia-Pacific region. But the focal point of the entire report was Australia, that Australia should be a launching pad for a renewed British imperial push into Asia, given the intimate ties between Britain and Australia already. As evidence of these ties, the report said that as of 1995, quote, Australia sent 35% of its offshore direct investment to Britain, which is 8 times more than could be expected from the size of the UK economy. While from the other direction, the UK sends about 7% of its offshore investment to Australia, which is 5 times more than could be expected from the size of the Australian economy. End quote. By 2008, the UK, with its population of 60 million people, had the highest total foreign investment in Australia of any country, with $427 billion of investment. And that was opposed to only $74.5 billion in 1994. By comparison, the United States, with a population of 300 million, had only $418 billion of foreign investment. Already by 1994, 130 British-owned companies had set up their Asia-Pacific headquarters in Australia, and many more have done so since. Over the last 14 years since the RIIA report was written, these flows of British capital into Australia have only increased, particularly given the massive looting operations represented by the mining boom of the last 12 years, which is dominated by the British raw materials cartel. In fact, while these British firms come here to loot us, Her Majesty's Australian toadies, such as the clown Bob Hawke and his nasty offsider Paul Keating, laid out the welcome mat for them when they started the whole regime of free trade and globalisation, which has destroyed our farms and small and medium-sized manufacturing industries. And that was the intent of this so-called deregulation of the Australian economy, beginning under Hawke and the world's greatest treasurer, Paul Keating, the same Paul Keating who is now the chief executive of a private international merchant banking firm, one which would have made a tidy bundle if the privatisation of New South Wales electricity industry had gone ahead. Keating said that Australia's new role in the British Empire was to be a raw materials exporter, that is, a quarry. If other industries survived, fine, but they were no longer a priority. Australia's economic future lay in minerals exports, with maybe a bit of wool and wheat thrown in. And Kevin Rudd, like Hawke, and Keating and Howard before him, is nothing but a British imperial puppet in this process. As Prime Minister and Labor Party leader, Rudd has campaigned for an ever greater financier dominance of Australia's financial system, including under the guise of independence for the privately controlled Reserve Bank. He has committed Australia to lead the world in the British genocidal crusade on climate change, for which he was the lead author of the climate change document adopted at the recent CHOGM meeting, which would ensure our agro-industrial oblivion. He has provided government funds to bail out the banks and provided untold billions of taxpayer-backed government guarantees, and he has spearheaded the British push to coordinate a global bailout, aka stimulus package, through the G20 and International Monetary Fund, and he has crusade for even more British trade. In the course of this latter crusade, in February he proclaimed that protectionism is intrinsically evil. In the latest issue of our New Citizen, we documented Kev's further role. Detail including perhaps his formal recruitment by British intelligence early in his career, and the fact that the overwhelming majority of the income into the Rudd family household, and a household now worth an estimated 60 million, comes directly from the British government via his wife's company. As you might expect of such a British toady, he is personally terrified of LaRouche, as in his response to a question at a public forum in Queensland earlier this year, where he spat the dummy and exploded, "LaRouche is right off the planet." So if Australia is to have a future, we must have the guts to do several things. First, we should just quit the Commonwealth, full stop. Get out. Secondly, we must dump the Queen as our head of state, junk our inherently weak and corrupt parliamentary system run by the Crown, and establish a republic, a course to which our greatest Republican, the Reverend John Dunmore Lang, devoted his entire life, to establish what he called a new United States of the Southern Seas. And third, we must nationalise our huge raw materials deposits, some of the richest in the entire world, and take them back from such British Crown cartels as Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton. Let me review a stark example in our recent history to show you why these are not just nice ideas or options, but are vital. After many years in the wilderness, the Australian Labor Party came back to power in 1972 under Gough Whitlam. Whitlam was not perfect by any means, but his government planned to buy back the farm, to take sovereign control of the nation's resources back from the Queen's cartel, led then by Rio Tinto, so we could implement grand development plans such as the energy and infrastructure projects planned by Rex O'Connor, Whitlam's Minerals and Energy Minister. Of course, since the government had no sovereign control of credit, it had to look elsewhere to find the means to begin to implement these ideas. In the midst of an orchestrated scandal over this, the Queen directed her Governor-General, a dog by the name of John Kerr, to sack Whitlam. Anyone who believes that Kerr, a long-time MI6 agent and notorious lapdog for the Queen, just up and did it by himself, as Whitlam himself believed, is a fool. In fact, the Queen showered all kinds of honours and decorations over Kerr right afterwards for his action. So, providing we act boldly and in our sovereign national interest to dump the Queen and her cartels, look at the enormous potential we have. For instance, LaRouche has emphasised the extraordinary importance of the huge raw materials deposits of Siberia for both Russia and for the whole region, for countries such as China and India, who are lacking many essential raw materials. There are many comparisons between Siberia and Australia. As you can see, our total land area is about the same as Siberia and the Russian Far East. And like those territories, Australia is very thinly populated. And we will have to build entire new cities through Australia, just as the Russians will have to do there. We're lucky we don't suffer from permafrost. But look at our incredible wealth of resources similar to those of Siberia and the Far East. Australia has the world's largest deposits of recoverable brown coal, lead, rutile, zircon, nickel, tantalum, uranium and zinc, and ranks second in the world for bauxite, copper, gold, ilmenite, which is a source of tungsten, and silver. Our reserves of industrial diamonds are third largest in the world, and those of manganese ore are fourth. We are also the largest exporter of alumina, black coal, iron ore, lead and zinc. Reflecting the purposeful destruction of much of our agro-industrial base, particularly since Hawke and Keating, the resource sector is the country's largest single export sector. In 2006-2007, over 80% of its output was exported, accounting for approximately 49% of all of the total goods and services exports, and 63% of Australia's merchandise export earnings. In 2006-2007, mineral resource exports totalled $107.8 billion, or 77.4% of Australia's total commodity trade. From 2001 to 2007, Australian mine production increased by almost 21% to meet world demand, with China and Japan being Australia's largest buyers of minerals. But the problem is this: all these raw materials, just as with a British colony in Africa, are exported unprocessed. And the only so-called development associated with these exports are the railroads which are built from the mines to the coasts, exactly like in Africa. And even back in the days when we used to have a half-decent railroad system, the British purposely constructed on all different gauges in different states to keep us disunited. But I want to emphasise our wealth in two minerals in particular, and what they mean to our national development over the decades ahead: uranium and thorium. As you can see, Australia also holds the world's largest reserves of non-recoverable resources of uranium. 24% of the total, ahead of second place Kazakhstan with 17%. But we have a staggering 40% of reserves recoverable at low cost. We now produce 22% of the world's supply, second only to the 29% of Canada, another Crown colony which LaRouche expects is likely to break with the British Empire, also for the reasons of national survival. We also have the world's largest resources of thorium, ahead of India, which is second. Now, once we throw off the shackles of British monetarism, these two minerals in particular open up an entire new world for ourselves and for our neighbours. To develop Australia, once we have sovereign control of our national credit, we will begin by building great national infrastructure projects similar to what FDR did to pull the US out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, but which the Bank of England and the Crown prevented us from doing, even sacking Jack Lang as Premier of New South Wales to maintain their stranglehold on us. These great infrastructure development projects will be in three areas, all of which we are desperately short of right now: power, water and transport. Let me develop the basic outlines of these. For power, we will develop a world-class nuclear power industry using our unmatched supplies of the basic nuclear fuels, uranium and thorium. To not do so would be the height of idiocy. The rest of the world is clearly going nuclear, so we can either join them or sit here sweltering in the dark. Even more, we can actually play a leading role in developing this industry worldwide, not only by processing our uranium and thorium for export, but by developing a whole new high-technology nuclear industry, including whole nuclear plants for export. Now, some of you have been brainwashed by the Greens, might say, we can't do that. We can't do that. Ha! Why not? If you're worried about danger, I suppose you could always create a problem with any technology if you really wanted to. For instance, you could really hurt yourself by hitting yourself on the head with a hammer or holding a lighted match under your nose. But no one's proposing banning hammers or matches, at least not yet. The reality is that the development of mankind throughout history has always been based on the use of higher and higher technologies, in particular by developing energy sources with higher and higher energy flux densities. As you notice in this table, from burning wood to charcoal to coke to coal to coke to oil and gas and other fossil fuels, to fission and to fusion power, the way the sun makes its energy. This table demonstrates the total lunacy of relying on the very weak energy flux density of solar-based technologies for the development of modern, high-tech, high-energy-based economies. New generations of nuclear power plants have been designed, known as pebble bed reactors, which are absolutely safe and meltdown proof. And thorium is a great fuel for reactors because almost all natural thorium is usable in a reactor compared to just 0.7% of uranium. India has a rapidly developing research program into thorium reactors, and we should collaborate with her on that. In addition to mastering ever denser sources of energy, the history of mankind has also been one of using an ever-increasing number of elements of the periodical table, as you see here. And that is what we will be doing with thorium, uranium, and the numerous other minerals Australia is blessed with. This animation is from a presentation made by Dr. Sergei Kurkozov of the Russian Vernadsky State Geological Museum at a 2007 conference of the Schiller Institute. The increasing mastery of the periodic table is an excellent example of the creative powers of the human mind. Now, for the second major aspect of infrastructure, aspect of our infrastructure, we also have to disregard the raving, unscientific, greeny nonsense about wild rivers and the like, and build numerous great water projects to ensure our supplies and to green our great deserts. In collaboration with Professor Lance Endersby and other of our national water experts, the CEC already in 2002 outlined 18 great water projects, the research for which is almost already completed and which we could start building tomorrow. Our estimate in 2002 was that all of these could be built for about $40 billion. In our third major area of infrastructure, transport, we have to build a high-speed rail grid, particularly around each of our major cities and between them to unite our great continent. The Australian ring rail proposal by Professor Endersby is typical of what we should do, which would allow us to cheaply export our manufactures or agricultural products through Darwin to Asia. China has already built a working high-speed train between Beijing and Tianjin, which travels at 350 kilometres per hour. China plans to spend more than $1 trillion on expanding its railway network from the 778,000 kilometres it has today to 110,000 kilometres by 2012 and to 120,000 kilometres by 2020. By 2020, 13,000 kilometres of this will be high-speed rail. China is also working with the Russians to build high-speed rail in Russia, and this was elaborated in the deals that they signed in September and October. And there is another great project in which we must engage, and that is to develop a space industry. We already have some valuable experience in that field and have an ideal location at Cape York near the equator for launching spacecraft. Over the next several generations, the real future for mankind and of mankind is in going to the moon, to develop a base there for the colonisation of Mars over the next century or so, just as Columbus set out to find and colonise a new world across the Atlantic. Already 10 nations have plans to set up industrial complexes on the moon. We must join them and inspire generations of young Australians to master the great challenges of space travel and colonisation. And the challenge of mastering space brings me to my next point, our indispensable cultural role in the Pacific region. Without in any way denigrating any other cultures, we in Australia are fortunate in that we embody the most powerful cultural potential mankind has developed. That culture extends from classical Greece through Christianity into the 15th century Golden Renaissance, a culture which gave birth to our modern nation-state-centred civilisation. But the guiding principle of this Western European culture, however badly it's been abused by the British Empire, is that by virtue of the innate creative potentials of the human mind, each individual man and woman is created in the image of God the Creator. And that this creativity, this spark of divinity within us, is what makes the life of each and every human being sacred. For instance, our last new citizen carries research, a groundbreaking research, on how our forebears were not just thieves and convicts of all sorts who were scooped out of the jails of England and shipped out here. On the contrary, the majority of those shipped out here in 1788, right after the world-shaking American Revolution, were fiercely pro-American political prisoners who, because of their noble political ideals, the British were terrified to leave them at home, lest they infect the British Isles with this sort of spirit of republicanism, this passionate belief in the profound worth of every human soul. This republican culture is very deep within us. It's very deep within us, which is why we voted down the fraud which Turnbull and the Queen's Privy Councillors were trying to sell us for a republic back in the 1990s. Finally, with this turn to a new Pacific-centred world, and given what I've just said about our underlying republican cultures, there are some scores which we have to settle within ourselves, as well as with the Queen and her murderous husband. Our nation, the Commonwealth of Australia, was founded in 1901 as a result of two primary but conflicting impulses. The British money power caused the Deep Depression in the early 1890s here, leading to the Great Maritime and Shearers' Strike of 1894, which they ordered be put down with bayonets and bullets. What ensued from that was a political mass strike, in which the best of the labour movement demanded an American-style republic and pointedly took the American spelling of Labour, L-A-B-O-R, for the name of their new party, the Australian Labor Party, to signify those ideals. However, the British demanded federation under the Crown, and as a dirty trick to help make sure that they got that, as well as to supply slave labour for their plantations, they encouraged the immigration of Chinese, Pacific Islanders and other people from the Pacific region who would work for a fraction that Australians would. Under that threat, and with some brainwashing provided by the eugenics movement which the British invented in the 1880s and 1890s, that there are inferior and superior races, just like Prince Philip believes today, the Labor movement adopted the White Australia policy. Many Labor leaders, even such a great organiser as W.G. Spence, founder of the Australian Workers' Union, therefore huddled for protection under the Crown against what they viewed as the danger of being so-called swamped by Asians. This heritage raised its ugly head again under the pathetic Pauline Hanson, who was just a manipulated fool for the establishment to make sure the unrest in rural and regional Australia did not turn to the CEC and to LaRouche's ideas. Not long after, John Howard once again manipulated those sentiments around the boat people issue to win himself an election. The British would always have us view ourselves as victims, either victims to the unchangeable ruling Anglophile establishment, or as victims who might be lost in the masses, among the masses of Asia, were we actually independent. But tonight I'm proposing, at long last, an entirely different way of viewing our position here in the Pacific. Our great water expert and the designer of the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Bradfield scheme to water Queensland and much of inland Australia, Dr. J.J.C. Bradfield, in the early 1940s saw us as a proud nation of 300 million people who were taming our vast, rugged continent and mastering any challenges before us. And that's the vision which tonight I invite you to adopt once again, of a nation free at last of British monetarist imperialism, and with the kind of optimistic, we can do anything attitude for which Australians were once famous, including in their highly valued participation in the US space program. As to how we achieve the goals I have outlined, I ask you to reflect deeply on this mass strike process which is now sweeping the American political landscape, and of which you who are watching now have yourselves had a real taste in this defeat, which we in Australia have dealt the Queen on the global warming fraud, whatever happens in the coming weeks at Copenhagen. This developing mass strike is deeper, a more powerful process than almost any of you have experienced in your lifetimes, comparable only to how the nation united during World War II and, before that, to the great upheavals of the 1890s, which produced the first Labor government in the world in Queensland. The greatest disservice that we can do ourselves is to deny our almost unique republican birthright, even marred as it is with the whips and chains of British imperialism. So I ask you to contact the CEC, to organise with us to take advantage of this unique moment in world history. It is precisely the profound depth of the present global financial and economic crisis which is shaking the ruling pillars of power. With a bit of a push in the right direction, they will collapse, and we can create a nation which our children, their children, and all Australians for untold generations to come can be proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I'll take some questions that have been submitted via the website first, but if anybody in the audience here tonight would like to ask a question, can you please write it down and I will read it out from here. Jeremy has some cards and pens there if anyone would like to put forward a question. And while that's happening, I'll move on with the first question, which is from Jenna Oakley in Queensland. Is it possible for the government to create a two-way road system that would run along the outskirts by the side of our current country rail lines, utilising our dying railway stations as depots? These storage depots would be where our heavy freight trucks, etc., transfer their load onto lighter, smaller vans to their delivery points of each country town. In turn, this gets more out of our $1 million railway loss and lightens up and makes safer our current road system. If we got the heavy freight moving vehicles off our roads and leave them for our people carriers only. Environmentally, this is far more sound if viable.
It's possible for the government to do anything it chooses. The question, why hasn't it been done? And this question really gets to the heart of what has to be done for Australia, and that's the issue of developing new industries, to developing the productive industries that we've lost over the last 40, 50 years, basically since the wind down of the post-war reconstruction schemes, of which we only built one, which was the Snowy Mountain scheme. There was others. There was a Bradfield scheme and Clarence River scheme were all proposed to be built as great infrastructure development projects in the post-war period. The problem is you can't piece back what's already disintegrated. All you can do is revolutionise it. And that's what the genius was of Professor Lance Endersby, because he saw that we had a massive tyranny of distance in this country and proposed not only the water projects, but he proposed this high-speed rail corridor up through the centre of the country. And the way you have to look at this, it's not just a railway line shifting people, but this is like an artery to provide production. And what you do with these sorts of things is you do what LaRouche's proposed, Mr. LaRouche's proposed with the Eurasian land bridge proposal for Asia, where you have these vast barren areas like in Siberia and otherwise, right, where there's nothing there. You actually have a planned approach. The government decides to do something. These development deals between China and Russia are uniquely government to government. The government is directing the development. So we can say that we want a development corridor right up through inland New South Wales, in through inland Queensland, up through the Northern Territory to Darwin, and then down through Western Australia. A development corridor that consists not just of a high-speed rail, but of water projects to provide water if there isn't any. It will provide decent highways up through that area. It will provide the necessary government assistance to develop entire new areas. And that means you can what you do is you allow the people of Australia to be creative. If people see an opportunity in these remote areas that can be built, you support them. And you don't put money in the middle of the equation. What you have to look at, are we increasing the real wealth of our country, which is real physical production? What are we producing? So what you do with these sorts of large infrastructure projects is you provide the basis upon growing the economy, growing the physical economy. You're growing the enterprise, the creativity, the potential for creativity of people, and you support them in it. So you take very inhospitable areas, like with Russia, it's the Siberia with their permafrost and pretty cold places, which it's hard to imagine. But you do the same in the centre of Australia, where it gets very, very hot. You may decide to establish a town there, a city, but you plan it. And then you provide the power. You provide nuclear power. You don't do this insane stuff of running power cables, 1,000 kilometres to a remote area. You provide pebble bed reactors, modular, high temperature, gas-cooled pebble bed reactors, the 100 megawatt variety. You can add to them, they're modular, you can just add one after the other as your city grows. You create localised nuclear power. And if the greenies don't like it, they don't have to live there. They can live in the cities and live in those areas if they want to. But what you have to do, and this is what Bradfield's proposal was to actually develop the country by developing the physical landscape. That's why he proposed the Bradfield scheme. That's what Lyndon LaRouche is proposing with the Eurasian land bridge. You open up vast areas to new production. And as you've seen with both Russia and Australia, we have enormous areas of raw materials wealth that can be developed. We don't necessarily, with high-speed rail and developing in town inside the country, have to be too concerned about location, right, for certain industries. But this is where people get really freaked out about the idea of having 300 million people. Our population density is about 2 to 3 per square kilometre. The entire internal part of the country is bone empty and bone dry. But it's empty. So you actually have to force development, creatively develop the inside of the country. And look, you're getting up to 300 million people over our land area. You're only talking about a jump, of 5 or 6 people per square kilometre if you average it out. And this means that when, coming back to the question in a sense, when you create an artery like that with an intention for production, then the existing infrastructure that's there can be slotted into it because the intention is production. Right? You don't have to modify the existing infrastructure simply to keep it there, but you actually give it a purpose. And that purpose is derived from having something that we actually produce. Now, Australia did have an extensive inland rail network, but it was all based upon, usually the huge amount of family farming that went on, which is now being shut down, and rail lines are just being pulled up because there's nothing going on out there. But this is a deliberate policy. And whenever you talk about development these days is how much does it cost? Well, who cares? How much does it cost if you don't do it? And that's more the issue that we're facing now. So whatever it costs to build Lance Endersby's Australian Ring Rail proposal, we should just get on and do it. We should build the Bradfield scheme, bring that water down, build the Clarence River scheme to help with the problems with the lack of water in the Murray-Darling system, build the Snowy Mountain scheme stage 2, build the Ord River scheme stage 2. You want to create jobs? You create it first by creating the productive industries that create productive jobs. I mean, Kevin Rudd's 52 billion, whatever it was, stimulus package does not address this issue. He's too scared because it means taking on the Mother Queen, taking on the British Empire. But we as a country can't develop if we get stuck and continue to be stuck as a country in the British Commonwealth dominated by a monetarist system. When you've got sovereign nation states, Russia and China, now collaborating together, sovereign nation states, and we're one of the 53 countries that just got given our marching orders by a queen who doesn't give a damn about the Australian people. If she did, we wouldn't be having the problems that we have, which are equivalent to being Africanised.
The next question really follows on from what you've just said. The question is from Stephen Trounson from Western Australia. I understand Mr LaRouche's hatred of the monetary system, and I understand what it is, though not how it works and its intricacies. Could you please explain the physical components of the credit system? The government pays for infrastructure, but what then? Who gets the money value, if any, of this infrastructure? How does the government retrieve the money it costs to build this infrastructure? How do government-induced fluctuations in amounts of money affect the agreed value of the currency on a global scale?
Well, first thing is you've got to forget money. It's overrated. It's a disease. What we've got in this world now is $1 quadrillion of this disease called money. It's unpayable, and it's bringing the entire world's financial and monetary system apart because it's speculation. Money is an idiot. It's overrated. What's not overrated is the need for physical economic production, like I said just before. So what you do is you don't worry about who's going to pay what back. You expand who's producing, who's in work, who's got meaningful jobs. You expand the pie. Not worry about, is this pie, how do I carve the pie up, but you expand it continuously because you are expanding the potential in the minds of the Australian population. You're expanding their creativity in productive enterprises. So when Mr LaRouche talks about his credit system, it's not money in the sense produced like it is now, which you can go to the bank and speculate with. This credit is directed specifically for large-scale infrastructure development projects for productive purposes. Full stop. it's used as a sovereign instrument of sovereign governments. I mean, when the American Revolutionary War was fought, Alexander Hamilton proposed national banking so that the national bank could take over the debt of the bankrupt 13 states that had fought the American War of Independence, the American Revolutionary War, because you can't have a sovereign nation state when someone else controls your credit. That's a monetary system. So he proposed a national bank, and he created the credit against the debt of those states and issued new credit for large-scale infrastructure development of productive industries. So by, in a sense, increasing the productive output, increasing the pie, growing it exponentially, and it grows very quick if you actually do this properly. You don't have to worry about where the money's coming from. Look, how does infrastructure work? Well, who's been across the Sydney Harbour Bridge lately? What would happen if that wasn't there? Can you imagine Sydney without the Sydney Harbour Bridge? Can you imagine the sort of economy that you wouldn't have? Imagine the inability to have a network train system. You see, this is another problem that JJC Bradfield was having and Jack Lang, is that they had to fight the same monetarists back then and say, oh, the bridge was too expensive. I think it was something like $80 million to build the bridge. Right? A pittance in today's terms. That bridge was built back in the 30s, was paid off, about 50 years later. But look what it did in terms of expanding the potential for production in the entire Sydney area. The time it took for people to get to work. And what happens is in production, people don't think about things like, the time it takes you to get to work. That's not factored into a monetarist scale of things. You're just slave fodder for the entrepreneurs to make money. And that's why we don't have the sort of infrastructure like high-speed trains that we should have in this country, particularly in the city regions. Because it's your time, who cares? But look what it's doing to the social fabric of families and so forth. The amount of time that you want to buy a house in Melbourne, you've got to go, 45 minutes, an hour out of town, then chog up the highways coming in to work in the morning and, stay in choked up highways going home at night. 2 hours travel each way, maybe more. So everyone gets fixated on money, right? What LaRouche is proposing with the credit system is, in his £4 alliance, is first of all the entire system has to be put into bankruptcy reorganisation, and that is done as a political agreement between sovereign nation states of Russia, China, India, and the United States. That's a political agreement. It's not a financial agreement. It's saying we as sovereign nation states are going to take control of our circumstances, our nation, and we are going to begin to issue new credit for development of our people, the general welfare principle. We are going to do that, right? We're not going to pay your debts. We're not going to pay your speculative money back. Forget it. It's gone. You went to the casino and gambled. You lost. Who goes back to the cashier of the casino and says, I just lost $100 million, can you give me my money back? No one does. Well, that's what we're talking about here. And then you have sovereign nation states. Australia, we've written the legislation, it's in our book, what Australia must do. A national bank. What do is you decide, as a country, what you want to produce, what is necessary to increase the potential relative population density. How do you increase the potential of your population to make changes to the environment, to increase more population? How do you do that? And you come up with, we need this infrastructure, we need better schools, we need decent hospitals, and you draw up like a bill. We need this. We need $100 billion worth of this infrastructure this year. We need $100 billion the following year, $100 billion the following year. And you go to the bank, you say, the National Commonwealth Credit Bank, and you say, we want to create $100 billion worth of credit to spend in these areas. And then you spend it in those areas for physical infrastructure. What happens is you end up with more production, happier people. The government, if you have a healthcare system, it's free. Eye care is free. Teeth, it's free. Dentistry, it's free. Our people might get the idea that their government actually cares for them. We're only Australians because we live here in Australia. Right? We live here in Australia, therefore our government is elected to so-called look after us, but you don't have a monetary system. They look after the British Crown and the British Imperial monetary system first. So you've got to turn the tables on it. As far as retrieving money and so forth to build this, you don't worry about that. It'll come back, just like I illustrated with the Sydney Harbour Bridge and other great infrastructure projects. You increase the physical capacity for production and you don't worry about money. And that is a very difficult issue for a lot of people, to forget about money.
The next question comes from Anthony Allison in New South Wales. I understand Lyndon LaRouche's argument that globalisation leads to the death and degradation of many people and hence argues against moves to reduce the population. However, as technology improves, it results in higher productivity per person. Within Lyndon LaRouche's system of economics, is there a case for population policy? Surely we don't need to keep increasing the world's population with the resultant strain this places on the resources of the planet.
This is the argument, you might say the de facto argument for population control. There's too many people because we've got scarce resources. Well, there's a bit of an irony here. There is scarce resources. But the only reason the resources are scarce is because we haven't made the commitment into the development of the potential of all the human beings on the face of this planet. And population policy, yeah, we should have as many people as possible who want to live. Can we support that many people? 6, 10, 12, 15 billion people? Of course we can. But we have to change our axioms about trying to make money in the process of doing it to actually saying, well, how do we support these populations? And this is where Lynn's work specifically comes into this issue of immediately, well, if the world gets overpopulated, so-called, we'll just go out into space. We'll populate the moon, we'll populate Mars, we'll go elsewhere. Because the idea of a resource is directly tied to the level of scientific and technological progress that is in a society at any particular time. And he's made it very clear, Lynn's made it very clear,
This occurs
at the present time, our world
at a time where the world
2 billion people, and we've got 6.7 billion people. Why? Because we aren't yet fully committed to moving into the technologies to provide the resources to support the 6.7 billion people. We're still very much reliant on fossil fuels. We haven't moved into the nuclear realm of developing fission power enough and then fusion power enough. I mean, you take, for example, Australia. We haven't mined 1 tonne of thorium. We have the world's largest reserves of thorium. We haven't mined 1 tonne. Why? Because there's no demand. Why? It's because the research into the development of thorium reactors was pretty much shut down in the 70s, the 50s, 60s and 70s. The technology exists. India is doing a great job in establishing the fast thorium breeder reactor. And thorium is a wonderful nuclear power. Why? Because it gives 40 times more energy per gram of fissionable material, which means you've got an enormous potential for high, cheap energy if you move in that direction. So when everyone talks about population issues, they always talk about static levels or zero technological growth. They rule out who we are as human beings. And are there scarce resources? Yes, there are. And Lynn goes through this in detail in his publications, and the Basement Crew and the LaRouche Youth Movement talk about this a lot in terms of the work of Vladimir Vernadsky, the biogeochemist, that made the tremendous discoveries on the various, the way the universe works, and that we have effectively 3 distinct phases. You have the lithosphere, which is the inert phase, you have the biosphere, and you have the noosphere. But each of these phases is governed by what we call universal physical principles. For example, the biosphere is governed by the universal physical principle of life. That's what governs the biosphere. And what you have had in the lithosphere, which we're now busily digging great holes all right around Australia, is the action of life, that is microbes, over the millions and millions of years have distilled, have brought together various elements, whether it be iron or copper or whatever, and they've deposited them in certain very rich deposits. So we come along and we dig them out real quick, right? And that's what we've been doing. But we're getting to the point where those resources are going to be depleted. That's like basic logic, if you want it. But those resources are going to be depleted. So what do you have to do in order to make sure that you can continue an ever-expanding supply of resources? You have to increase the energy flux density that's available to mankind. And that's where the third part of this, the noosphere comes in. Because what we are as human beings, we live in the noosphere. We're not just mere animals. Yes, we have life and we live, but we have something greater, which is this power of cognition. The ability to actually make discoveries of unseen physical principles. You don't see gravity. You don't see life. But what you do see with your central apparatus is you see the effects of those physical principles. And in this universe of ours, as human beings, what we can notice is that these visual senses or auditory senses or whatever create paradoxes, if you're serious about looking at them. And therefore you can make discoveries by looking at the paradoxes of these universal physical principles, which means there's many physical principles we haven't discovered. As we discover those, we open up the potential for not only just larger and larger access to higher and higher technologies. We can turn those technologies through the scientific and technological development process into being able to recover the elements that are currently scarce in the Earth's crust. You've got ideas, things like fusion torches, of taking, vaporising down to the molecular level materials and sifting out the various elemental forms of those. You have enormous numbers of very high-tech processes that are available to us, which no longer actually means that we have to live in a world of scarce resources. Take water, for example. Why have we got a water shortage in Australia? It's not because there's no water, we're surrounded by it. Where's our nuclear power industry that can desalinate the seawater? Why haven't we got fission reactors, or better still, fusion reactors that can create rivers of fresh water in Melbourne? Because for the very reason the argument always comes up about population is because people deny the creative powers that make them different to an animal, that can make the discoveries of physical principles that can change, literally change the environment that we live in. And the point is that there are boundary conditions to what we know on Earth. And that's why Lynn and LaRouche has proposed that we go to Mars. Because by going to Mars, what you do is you propose enormous paradoxes. Like, for example, how can you get to Mars and not end up like a blob of jelly on the bottom of the spacecraft because of no gravity? How can you get there? Well, we have to develop the ability to travel at 1g, which is Earth's gravitational field. 1g acceleration and 1g deceleration. How do you do that? Well, you need to develop fission and fusion powered rockets. There's already designs for these things. They were done in the 50s and the 60s. It was shut down because at the outset we were governed by this monetarist system. And, it's an empire. And that anyone that's, like Prince Philip, who wants to cull everyone by coming back as a deadly virus, doesn't see human beings as created in the image of God. He sees them as pestilence, plague to cull. And that's been the governing dynamic of this empire for thousands of years, actually. And we've seen glimmers where things have broken through, like what was done with the American, the foundation of the United States through the collaboration of Cusa and Columbus and others. And you've seen the breakthrough come with what Abraham Lincoln did, particularly with his moves after the American Civil War to establish the great continental railroad systems there, which opened up the incredible, optimism, but also the incredible productive capacity of the United States. And then you saw it under Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt's intention wasn't to go with this monetarism. He told Winston Churchill very clearly, Winston, after the war, we're not going to have any more of these 19th century British colonial type methods. We're going to have 20th century methods, which means sovereign nation states. He intended to have the credit system that LaRouche is providing now. We're just 60 years odd too late. It's the same thing. It's the same idea, to have a communion, if you like, of sovereign nation-state republics, perfectly sovereign, creating their own credit for large-scale internal development, and to destroy the parasite of this British monetarist nightmare that the world's lived in ever since. And that's what LaRouche's credit system is all about. First and foremost, it's about the principle of supporting the general welfare, using the powers of government to support the general welfare, subordinating this monetarist system, this money, to production, to development first and foremost. Just like the great Labor leaders of the past understood. This is not rocket science. This has been known in the past. The question, though, in populations like ours is there the political will to fight for it again? And for the last 21 years, that's what we have been doing as the CEC here in Australia, and that's why uniquely we're still here, stronger than ever, and we need to have a republic and a credit system that goes with it, and we'll do very well if you let the creative people in our country loose.
We have a question from Bill McKelvey in Victoria. Bill asks, I read with interest your comments on a regular basis via the email. I agree with most of what you say, if not always the language used. Sugar attracts more ants than vinegar, so likening people to Hitler or Nazis is a bit of a turn-off. What about the treachery of the Copenhagen summit, where it is alleged our trusted politicians are signing up to world government under UN? This is in the fine print of the agreement they are there to sign. This was revealed on Sydney radio by one of Margaret Thatcher's former advisers. This carbon tax is another tax to feed a burgeoning public service that will need more staff to administer it, more office space to house them, and of course more greenhouse emitting power to heat and cool them. Can't you get more people in the mainstream media to tell the truth, so the ordinary mums and dads who believe what they are told by the media will jump up and down? They are unfortunately the voting majority that politicians have hoodwinked, the few like us. They seem to be able to sidestep as fanatics or misled sceptics.
There's a bit of a paradox in your question, because on the one hand you're saying you want people to tell the truth, and when we do and call people Hitler and Nazis, because they are, you don't like it. So I'm not being nasty or anything in that sense, but see, that's the problem. Is people talk about the truth and they want to hear the truth, but they say that, but they don't really. Because the truth in these times is somewhat scary. And look, the CEC doesn't back off the truth. Go back, you only have to go back and look at our material, and we have always been, in a sense, ahead of the curve with LaRouche on truth. Why did we put out global warming is a fraud to 540,000 odd papers when there was no other resistance in the population effective, no institutional resistance? Because it was a truth. That's all. Tell the truth. Now, in this parliamentary system, you can't tell the truth. Are there people in there that would like to? Yes. Are there people that would love to work with the credit system and develop our country and have a magnetic levitation train system and high-speed systems and water projects? Yes. Are they going to get it under the crown? No. So these guys, they're not bad people, but they're not like us because we're prepared to tell the truth. If they tell the truth in their parties, they get deselected, thrown out, removed, quick as anything. And I somewhat feel sorry for them because, it's a horrible, horrible compromise to have to compromise on the truth. And global warming is a fraud. Barack Obama is a Hitler type. His policies are Hitler. He wants to kill people. Period. Go and have a look at his own legislation. It's taken exactly from the T4, the Tiergarten 4 legislation, word for word. The intention is to destroy anyone with disability, kill them off, deny them health care. Anyone with that's old, to euthanize them. Anyone that's under the age of 15 or over 50, deny them health care. But see what people don't realise is that's a British policy. It came out of the NICE system in England. It's what we've adopted lock, stock and barrel. We've had this system for ages. Passive euthanasia. 1 in 6 people in the United States were euthanised against their will through passive euthanasia. 1 in 6 people. That's disgusting. But see, that's the culture. That's what the world's degenerated to under a monetary system. So truth, it's a very interesting thing. What I think you should do is join us. Come and learn what real truth is. Come and learn how the mass strike works. We're not directing this mass strike. Not from the point of view we caused it or anything. All we did was tell the truth, and we've done it effective, and we've put a lot of material out over the years. It's great cost to our supporters. Right, we're not a wealthy organisation, but we put stuff out at great cost to ourselves even when we can't afford it, because it's the truth and has to be told in a certain period of history. A pregnant period of history, you've got to put the truth out there, you just do it no matter what. And that's what we've always done. So you say, who you can trust? Well, you say, who's their master? What have they done? Look at all the political movements that have come and gone in the last 21 years, in particular. People out there are hurting. This carbon tax would have been a disaster, but it was designed to be a disaster. It's designed to depopulate us. We've lost our producers. Family farmers are being crucified. Why? Look what Keating said. We don't want wool and wheat anymore. We don't want agriculture. We want to be a big hole in the ground. That's what he said. And look what's happened. Where's the support for our farmers? Why do they have to pay fertiliser prices 5 and 6 times higher? Put up with the processes of government stripping away things like the Australian Wheat Marketing Board, the AWB, in order to, which was set up by the National Party 60, 70 years ago to protect the farmers against the very thing now they're having to face. Any country that does that to their producers, unfortunately, doesn't have the moral fitness to survive. So we better change our ways, otherwise we're going to become extinct people, and pretty fast.
This question also bears upon this mass strike phenomenon. This comes from Mandy Crerar in Victoria. Hi Craig, how much do you think Tony Scabbett and his new front bench understand about the larger clause of submitting any vestige of sovereignty to a new world order via the ETS mandate? And does this make them less traitorous if they do understand this than the sell-out stance of Labor?
I think you heard the pedigree of Tony Abbott in my speech, my presentation. This is just two sides of the same coin. They're both owned by the same mother, if you like, the Queen. The point is that this is just typical of the crap games that are played in parliamentary systems. It means absolutely nothing in the longer curvature, and you're going to see a great operation to hoodwink the Australian people that Tony Abbott's a great guy. That's what you're seeing here. This is just a joke. I mean, the guy, Tony Abbott, was John Howard's protege, you might say. And he's been trained in the same policies. There's nothing different about Tony Abbott. Australians for, the constitutional monarchy. He supports the same disease that we're trying to get rid of. Right? He's going to play tricky politics. He's going to try and soak up as many votes as he can. He's going to pretend that he's going to be your saviour. But he is going to be a disaster like every other Liberal or Labor politician's ever done that in the history of our country. Because that's what he represents. Look, the last real credible politician, there's people within the Whitlam, people like Rex Connor and Jim Cairns. Jim Cairns supported LaRouche's call for a new Bretton Woods. These guys had what it took to represent our country. And you have to go way back to Ben Chifley, as far as I can see, to anyone that had the quality to stand on principle no matter what. Then you've got others there, of course, like John Curtin, and you keep going back through the old Labor movement. Look at the quality of those people. Look what they stood for. They actually stood for the general welfare. So when you look at Tony Abbott, as you say, Scabbit, I think he is a bit of a flake on the top of a very nasty disease, and that's our parliamentary system. We need to change that. It's going to be an all-out fight to change that. It's going to take some time. It's going to take a whole new generation to educate themselves in what actually a republic is. That's what we have to do. We've written a lot of material about this in our what we call our Cynici News Sit, where we go through the pedigree of the Liberal Party, founded by fascists, founded by the people that loved Mussolini. That's who the Liberal Party's roots are. Robert Menzies was a creep. The guy benefited from literally the blood and the flesh of John Curtin and Ben Chifley. These were the guys that put into place the post-war reforms, that brought in social security reforms and all sorts of different reforms during the war. They took the hard yards on, and Menzies just came in afterwards and sort of creamed it off. And people say that Menzies was such a great leader. I can't find a damn thing that this guy's done that's worth talking about. Otherwise we would have already found it. Right? So that's what you're talking about. Do political parties change their colours? No, they just go out of business, like the Democrats and others. So, I mean, that's what you're talking about with Tony Abbott. If you believe the hype, the lies and the media, then you're going to be very, very foolish. And what's more, it really does worry me that our population can be so fooled by this again and again and again and again. So, we need everyone's help in making sure that people know what the truth is in this particular period of time. Look, Tony Abbott hasn't come out and said that global warming is a fraud. He hasn't said that yet. Why not? Up front, it's a fraud. He hasn't said it. He's been playing political games, and therein lies a rub. Guy's not prepared to tell the truth straight, forget him. He'll be manipulated around through the system, and our country will suffer in the process.
And as a matter of fact, Senator Ron Boswell admitted that the only reason really that the Liberal National Coalition was forced to listen to the voice of their supporters is that otherwise they would look to the charlatan extreme right for leadership and political representation. And that was in his own statement of November 19 on his website. So he wouldn't possibly mean us, I wouldn't think. We have a question from L. Wood from Western Australia. As a pensioner, we are caught between woe and go. If we go out and try and earn money to help ourselves, we are penalised by the Centrelink income test. Then, on the other hand, if we say, woe, we don't want to die on the job and we've had enough of work, we can basically survive on the pension without any frills. What do you believe is the fate of the pensioner in the future? Are we looking at even higher GST and other taxes and food prices, escalating if the global warming theory puts even more costs onto farmers in carbon taxes, etc.? Are pensioners doomed to lose their mobility due to even higher fuel costs? If euthanasia is legalised, could excuses be made for us to be legally eliminated because it would be too costly to keep us fed and cared for. What is the future for us oldies? Are we being made to feel we are a financial burden on society?
Yes, you are. And it's disgusting. I mean, I think that we have an incredible wealth of older Australians that are pensioners now who represent a national treasure to our country. And if we are to build anything, we are going to need to call on those people. But see, that's not the policy that reigns. It's not the monetarist policy. The monetarist policy is that you are a cost burden. Prince Philip wants to reduce the world's population from 6.7 billion to 2 billion. And the older people are higher on the list, as demonstrated by the healthcare policies, by the push for euthanasia. So it's a worry. It's a real worry for a lot of pensioners that have spent their entire life working and don't have enough to live on. If the ETS tax ever gets up, and hopefully the mass strike will knock it down and take out the political parties with it, then that's one less burden, but it doesn't solve the problem. You have to increase the productive potential of our country. We have to go with large-scale infrastructure development projects, build entire new industries, use the power of government to support and develop those industries. We have to bring back tariff controls on a lot of industries, rebuild them. 80% or so of what we produce in this country for our own domestic needs should be produced here. We should have 80% produced here. At the moment, it's all one way. It's all coming out of foreign countries. That's the metric of any country that's actually anyways halfways becoming sovereign. And that is a worry. I mean, look, it's a stated policy. They want to kill old people. They want to kill pensioners. They'll do it by reducing the pension if they can get away with it. Right? They'll reduce people, just basically down to serfs, to slaves. And that's an intentional policy. And that's why we have to fight it and have to beat it.
This is a question from a graduate student, Rez, from the University of New South Wales. He has 3 questions, actually. 1, can Australia supply nuclear fuel for Southeast Asia? 2, what kind of nuclear reactor will power with thorium? And 3, how about developing world and nuclear energy?
Well, Australia, as we've mentioned, has the world's largest reserves of thorium, and we have the largest reserves, low-cost reserves of uranium. Yes, we can. We can supply Southeast Asia with those products, but that would be a tremendous disservice to our country if that's all we were doing, continuing to export the raw materials. We should not do that. We should develop the nuclear industry within our country to do the reprocessing and value add to those products. I mean, the amount of alumina that we export from this country, we should have our own aluminium smelters, decent ones, producing all different grades of aluminium and so forth. So yeah, we can do that, but as a sovereign government acting in the national interest, we would do it on the basis of reciprocal development projects, just like Russia and China are doing. We're happy to develop, we're happy to export thorium, but we need you to participate in that in a sort of reciprocal deals. What kind of nuclear reactor will power thorium? Well, just about every type of nuclear reactor can power thorium. There's specific efficiencies that have to be developed, but India is doing that now with its fast thorium breeder reactor. But the science of thorium is very interesting, because thorium is basically what they call a fertile radioactive material, which means by itself it doesn't create nuclear reactions. So in a sense it's stable. In fact, the half-life of thorium is a huge, 3 Earth years or something huge, 3 huge half-lives. But when you stimulate that little thorium atom with something like plutonium, which gives off large numbers of neutrons, thorium will yield 40 times more power, in effect, per unit of weight. And the good thing is it doesn't actually then lead to large amounts of proliferable material that can be used for nuclear weapons. So what you can actually do is take thorium and in the fuel cell build in plutonium around it and burn up plutonium as a process of creating power. So that's absolutely brilliant. There's at least 3 times as much thorium available in the Earth's crust as there is uranium. So you have enormous resources when you compare it to uranium. And look, this technology, there's been research done on specific types of reactors in the United States, in Russia, in France, using different combinations of fuel rods and different combinations of these the fuel types to be able to stimulate thorium to create the nuclear reactions. But it's mostly been shut down, and India is the only country that is really developing this right now. And that's why I said before, we need to work in partnership with India to develop our own thorium nuclear industry, our own uranium nuclear industry. This is at our doorstep. We can do this. And then create modular high-temperature gas-cooled thorium-based reactors that we can send out all over the world. Create them in like assembly plants, car assembly plants. Assemble them that way and then send them out throughout the world. So, of course, in terms of how about developing world and nuclear energy, well, that's exactly what we actually have to do, not simply because it's somewhat of a nice idea, but it's absolutely vital to be able to provide the basis to which we can support 6.7 billion people.
This question comes from Alexandra Liddell from Queensland. How long can the market continue to be artificially propped up before boom goes to bust, or will it be a slow fizzle?
The system is dead. It's just waiting for a coffin to put it below ground. It's gone. It's gone now. The crash has happened. How long it takes for the corpse to be buried, I don't know. It's a bit like the analogy of cancer. Once you have been diagnosed with an unfortunate terminal disease, you can't necessarily predict how long it's going to be before you actually succumb to that fatal disease. It could be days, months or weeks. But we're now at a point, as you're seeing with the sovereign default of Dubai and many other countries, that the crisis that could have been solved initially starting in 2007 with Mr LaRouche's HBPA, the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, and here in Australia the same idea, in collaboration with the Four Powers Agreement back then, we didn't have to be where we are today. Is it going to be a fizzle or a pop? Well, I can't answer that. All I can say is the whole system is finished. We get a lot of these sorts of questions on the phones and from our contacts that are worried about their money. Where do I put my money? How do I save my money? Well, it's gone. There's no chance. It's finished. Unless we have the Four Powers Agreement and move in the direction that Mr LaRouche has said and specified, of which the directionality is coming with Russia and China, there is no chance. There's so much debt, so much unpayable debt, so many financial obligations in the system that it's unbelievably, well, it just can't be paid, right? So, I don't know. Tomorrow, could be tomorrow you wake up, the banks are all shut. Something's happened. I mean, we weren't expecting Dubai, were we? No. We don't know where it's going to break out. We don't know, how it's going to die, how quick or whatever, but it's gone. It's finished. And all you can do is organise with us politically to help change the system. Go for a credit system. Go for the Four Powers Agreement. The solution is a political solution. It's not a monetary solution. It's got nothing to do with money whatsoever. And we can do it. As LaRouche has pointed out, you get an alliance between Russia, China, India and the United States, And many other countries will jump on board immediately. They know the system's shot, finished. Maybe Australia will be the last. I don't know. I hope not. Maybe we have to do better and make sure we're the first in line once we get the Four Powers Agreement.
This question is somewhat similar from somebody in the audience here tonight, from a national business owner, and he would like to know, how does one both personally and if in business commercially best manage finances given what's happening and prepare for what is about to happen on an international scale economically?
With great difficulty. It's very difficult in this period of time. I mean, you've got a complete freeze up of the entire credit system, that is interbank credit system, because the entire system is coming down. Now you're going to get ups and downs and all sorts of games being played, but you know, the elites, the financiers know that this system's stuffed, it's finished. No planning can be done for any serious thinking people for the future whilst you have a monetarist system that's in the process of disintegration. There isn't anything you can do. I mean, you can shift money from one bank to the next, but which bank goes first? You can put it in the stock market and lose it, put it in superannuation and lose it, right? You could put it in cash, it gets destroyed. The value of your cash gets, you know, destroyed, like what was happening with the value of the US dollar, right? So there is no business solution in business. It's all, you know, high risk right now because the entire system is gone. So there's no way you can put your money under your bed or whatever and survive. Look, we're moving into hyperinflation. You get a period of initial deflation where companies and so forth are trying to flog off their assets or their products in order to get the cash flow coming in. It's sort of like an impulse, right? And what Rudd has done is chucked in $52 billion to stimulate demand so that you can go into their shop and buy those goods. But the problem is, a lot of those people go out of business because they can't afford to restock those goods because the price has gone up. So what happens is those goods become less and less available at a higher and higher price, hence the hyperinflation. And, you know, the way the system works is because it is a difficult thing for people to understand the difference between, say, financial aggregates and the triple curve. And I can give you an illustration that I've used around the country. And it gives you a sense of how the monetarist system, the speculative system, drives the physical producer out of work. You take, for example, here in Melbourne, we used to have a massive manufacturing area. It's greatly shrunk on what it used to be. I mean, the whole eastern suburbs used to be, according to various people who used to live here, just masses of factories, small family-owned factories, which have all been shut down because of globalisation and free trade. But take a hypothetical armature manufacturer, someone who uses a great deal of copper wire. A great deal of copper wire, because he manufactures armatures for starter motors, for electrical generators, for, you know, all sorts of small motors, large motors, right? And he's manufacturing using copper as a principal ingredient. So he goes into the market, and all of a sudden, the copper that used to be $1,000 a tonne, US dollars a tonne, is now jumped to $5,000 a tonne. And he has to buy 100 tonnes of that copper for every 3 months of operation. And so he's got 100 workers there that are happily producing these starter motors. And he says, okay, well, I can maybe mortgage the house and get the money necessary to buy 100 tonnes of copper. 100 tonnes of copper at $5,000 a tonne is $500,000. So our producer, he rings up his supplier, who has to look up the London Metals Exchange, and says, oh, on the 1st of June, the price of copper is $5,000. Therefore, it's $500,000 for 100 tonnes of copper. So he signs a contract that in 30 days he will take all his semi-trailers in and pick up that copper wire. And the trucks roll in on the 1st of July. He writes the cheque out, it goes through his bank, since mortgaged his house to pay for it. And for the next immediate period ahead, he starts continuing to manufacture copper-based starter motors and so forth. 3 months later, he's down to his last 10 tonnes of copper. So he rings up his supplier, and the supplier says, I'm sorry, but the price of copper now is $11,000 a tonne. $11,000 a tonne, but I can't afford that. I can only afford $350,000 towards copper. So the guy has to cut his supply of his request for the supply of copper down to the equivalent of $350,000 because that's all he's got. He goes in, he picks up what the equivalent of something like 31 tonnes of copper. But he's got 100 workers. What does he do? There's not enough raw materials to be able to support 100 workers, so he has to lay 50% or 60% of them off. So he has to sack 50 to 60 workers. And those workers go home, maybe get a bit of a severance pay. They've all got mortgages. They can no longer afford to buy the goods and services in the economy. Remember the second curve, how it dropped, like LaRouche was forecasting? They've got mortgages. They can't pay them. So the rate of housing foreclosures goes up in that particular area because, they can't afford to pay their mortgages. So this guy continues the process of making armatures with just, say, 30 workers. Meanwhile, the government's deregulated the entire system and free trade's bringing in very, very cheap starter motors and so forth from overseas, and the price is dropping. He has to drop his price to try and compete. At the same time all this is going on the 40th floor of Collins Street, you have a room with 100 computers in it, each with a commodities trader behind it. And the same commodity trader on the same day, the 1st of June, wants to buy copper to speculate in. But he doesn't want to buy 100 tonnes of copper, he'll buy 1 million tonnes of copper. And he'll go and he'll fork out $5 billion on credit of one of the big banks to buy that copper. But he doesn't intend to take delivery of it, he doesn't want to produce anything with it. 10 minutes after the trade is logged on the computer, the price goes up by $10. Sell! Sell! He just made a quick $10 million. A minute later, he reinvests. Same thing, another 1 million tonnes. This time at $5,009. And it goes up again, $5. Sell! And the frightening thing is, this is what is happening not just in those, with that one trader, but every one of those 100 traders on that floor in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of office blocks all around the world, all speculating on a physical commodity that is putting our physical productive workers out of work. There's your bottom curve falling through the floor if you extrapolate that across the entire world's economy. Think of that money, that $10 million profit being just piled upon into bank accounts or whatever as entries in the ledgers of a so-called profit. There's your monetary aggregates, money being created, right? But think about what the financial aggregates are in the sense of that now your workers, those 60 or 70 workers that you put out of work can't afford to buy the same level of groceries from the store. They can't buy what they used to. So the physical demand for goods and services falls through the floor. But you get to a point where you don't have any more producers anymore. You don't have any more farmers. People can't compete because it's all being governed by making money. And that's why this system has to be. You're going to hear talk about Abbott saying, we have to re-regulate the system. You're going to hear about bank bashing, how bad the banks are for making things so bad. Yeah, they're bad. But what we have to do is go with an entire new system. Wipe out the function, the monetarist function. Eliminate that monetary curve. Re-regulate the money supply in the sense of only creating the money necessary to fund physical production. Real physical production. Go back to the two curves. So that the real activity of your economy is production first and foremost. And the financial curves underneath is just a reflection of the ability of the community to buy and sell those, purchase those services. Money is not even there because it's so regulated it doesn't exist. So, if you're running a business like our armature manufacturer, I wouldn't suggest you stay there very long because you're going to suffer the same fate in this type of monetarist system as he is, as many businesses that are in productive industries know.
We probably have time for a few more questions. I'll preface this one by saying that the reference subject, Betty Windsor, the little Queen of England, is in a spot of bother when Lord Christopher Monckton tells EIR that she had better not intervene in politics again or she will lose our loyalty and then she will lose the throne. So, and no idle threat coming from the man whose grandfather arranged the abdication of Edward VIII. The question from Bill Bolton is, Craig, 2 questions. The Zionists control our de facto government in conjunction with Betty Windsor's Masons. They control our judicial system. How can we change that? The Brits have kept us in a quasi-colonial state simply because we have never issued a formal declaration of independence. Why don't we do just that? Don't forget that the Brits handed over their sovereignty to the European Union last Friday. What about ours?
We get a lot of, over the years, we've got a lot of people who get fixated on this group or that group, whether it be the Rothschilds or the Bilderberger Society or, there's so many of them, it almost, you sort of start to throw your hands up in the air. Look, the issue is not one particular group, it's the ideology, the philosophy that these guys adhere to. And they're all part of the same camp if they support British monetarism. And there's no solution by just picking on one little individual group. Yeah, they might be the most rotten people in the world, but the system still exists. It's a bit like having the boardroom in the monetarist empire and you just have the different changing chairmen. The boardroom still exists, the system still exists. So, you know, Queen Lizzie is a key part at the top of the chain. Edward VII used to be, in a sense, the doge of all doges. If you want to talk about Venetian financier models, he used to be the ruler of all rulers of this elite group of families and groups that support the concept of oligarchical control through empire. These guys scrambled all to be oligarchs. They scrambled to be all scrambled to be the Zeus, the gods of Olympus. But they also fight amongst themselves, which is interesting with Elisa's quotes from Lord Monckton. I mean, he tipped the bucket on her with what he said, but he says, I support my queen. Because he won't break from the system because he's part of it. He's made some very useful and honest statements about global warming, which are very useful because they're truth. And truth it doesn't matter who says the truth is the truth. And he has had whatever his own reasons, he has spoken the truth very loudly, which has had a ricocheting effect, brilliantly so, behind the Copenhagen discussions, and not so behind and quite up front, because I know there's a lot of people that are looking to Lord Monckton for leadership on this issue, but it's a mistake. This guy is part of the empire. He's part of the monetarist system that we've been talking about. He's part of that faction that the Americans had to fight a revolutionary war over in order to kick out because of their policies of free trade and globalisation and privatisation. So I would encourage the questioner to subscribe to some of our literature and open his eyes to a much bigger agenda than just trying to blame individual groups or individual groupings of people for this problem. The problem is, and it boils back to, the very attitude that the god Zeus, the king of the gods, Zeus, had towards people. That's where this starts. Do you believe that human beings are created in the image of God the Creator and endowed with creative reason, and therefore by that are innately sacred? Or do you believe, as the global warmers and the population control freaks and those hideous people like Prince Philip believe, that man is nothing more than another animal that has to be controlled and culled whenever necessary? If you believe the former, like we do, that man is in fact created in God's image and is sacred, then you're part of a true Republican faction. If you believe the latter, then you're part of the oligarchy. You may be very, very junior, but you share the same ideology. So when it comes to politics, when it comes to anything, you have to answer this question of any grouping. What is their view, their honest view of the nature of man? First and foremost. If you can answer that question of that group honestly and get the truth, then you'll know where you stand, because it actually all boils down to that.
We have a question from Peter Eddington from New South Wales. He asks, I agree with some of your ideas and not with others. The world's troubles are partly caused by globalisation. The globalisation is probably more US than British driven, but that is moot. Greed, generally, whether globalised or not, causes someone somewhere to miss out on something, and we are all too greedy. On climate change, I think that Australia, as the highest per capita CO2 emitter, should take a lead in cutting their pollution. Regardless of CO2 issues, exhaust from fossil fuels is noxious to humans and carbon particles lead to the smog, pollution and illness. There's another related question which I'll throw into that because it's also referencing pollution from Ray Thomas in Victoria, who says such huge amounts of gas are being exported. Does this mean, surely, an end to any hope of a national gas pipeline infrastructure to help provide lower pollution energy in the future?
Well, there's two parts to this question. One is on the issue of greed, and the other is on the question of CO2. And I want to take the greed one first because, you know, I have some chickens at home. And if you've ever seen chickens when they get a meat parcel or something that someone else wants, it's like war for all, right? And the problem is, that's what animal behaviour becomes. That's what animal behaviour becomes, but it's not human behaviour. Now, we are reduced. The population can be reduced to be animals if you have this financial oligarchy treating us like animals. And what you get is this excuse that greed is the root cause of the problem. It's not. If you treat people as human beings and give them the ability to develop their creative powers, they become human beings. They develop a beauty about them that is unbelievable, a power that is unbelievable. They're not animals. Consequently, we can change our environment. We can take young people, young kids, we can treat them like Africans and starve them to death by the millions. Or we can take those Africans, those young kids, and we can give them decent health care, access to clean water, decent energy so that the farms around them can produce decent food, decent agricultural technology. We can give them decent education and access to classical Greek education, the education that's involved in the 15th century Golden Renaissance, to master the principles of the universe that are there to be mastered by human beings. Not by chooks or dogs or cats, but human beings. And that's the policy of government. That should be the policy of government, is to develop, first and foremost, the potentialities of the population. Instead, we're not. We're treated like chooks. Joe Bjelke-Petersen used to talk about the media being chooks. Well, that's sometimes how you feel by the politicians today. You're just nothing more than chooks to be fed. And, you know, it's survival of the fittest, all this Darwinian crap stuff. It doesn't apply to human beings. We're fundamentally not animals. That's the first thing. And it's actually a cop-out to say greed's the issue, because it actually removes the issue of what are you going to do for humanity. And I hear it all the time, and it's wrong. The second thing is about CO2. CO2 is not a pollutant. It's not. It's plant food. Agriculture 101 taught us that CO2 is plant food. If you want to increase the production of green plant material, you feed the chlorophyll, you feed the plant structures. You give it decent sunlight, decent light, and plenty of CO2, so it can create the sugars necessary to create the various tissues that it needs to develop. If you've got a nursery, you close the nursery up and you pump CO2 into it. For goodness sake. Basic chemistry here. But see, most people aren't taught this. And they believe it because they don't know. And that's the biggest tragedy in one sense, is that people don't know some of this basic stuff. So when people start talking about cutting CO2, they actually don't know what they're talking about. They've been brainwashed, and happily brainwashed for whatever reason, into believing a lie. Right? I was talking to a doctor the other day who just could not get past this idea that the world is going to warm by 2 degrees because of CO2, man-made CO2. Just couldn't get past it, and this is an intelligent person. But see, what's happened with this CO2 debate, it's turned into a religious debate, in a sense. And it's been promoted as a religious debate. And if you ever try to oppose global warming, you are a skeptic. You're a non-believer. You're ostracised. Well, but that's not really the issue. The issue is the fact that you're telling the truth. If you you're trying to oppose global genocide, which is actually the truth behind the matter. You're trying to stop Prince Philip's plans. You're trying to stop the degeneration of the world from 6.7 to 2 billion people. And we do have problems with pollution in places, yeah, sure. But that's pollution. That's stuff that gets stuck in the rivers and so forth, in the air, that shouldn't be there. You use various types of technology to get rid of them. We've done that. You can do that stuff. But, if you want to pick on a real greenhouse gas, why not pick on water vapour? There's tons of it. Because it's not sexy.
Okay, this will be the final question. However, for those people who have submitted questions that haven't been answered yet, Craig will endeavour to reply to those questions in the coming days. This is a question from the audience. Thanks, Craig, for this great webcast. My question is, under our current parliamentary system, can we impeach the Prime Minister for the damage he is doing to our nation through carbon trading and other policies which are destroying our economy?
The only person that can impeach the Prime Minister is going to be the Queen or her Governor-General. Right? And he's doing such a great job for her in ruining our country that I doubt that is going to be possible. Look, the issue is actually having the guts to tell the truth and to come out and organise even when it's uncomfortable. Because being in politics these days, you have to deal with masses of ignorant people that believe in popular opinion. So consequently, can you impeach the President? Yeah, we can impeach him by actually voting him out, by developing and supporting another political organisation that's got the record on the board on the policy issues that will save our country, and replace him, not just replace him, but replace the entire rotten, smelly system. And that's what we're about. So the Queen can sack him at any time, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Sorry, one more final question. This is from Doug Mitchell from the LaRouche Youth Movement, Australia. Craig, you laid out a profound scientific task for Australia with the emphasis on developing the full use of our resources, which will take many years. In the organising, on the streets, etc., there are many unscientific young people who can't have a rational discussion about nuclear power. They think solar is the answer. How are we going to educate our young people to be optimistic and to develop a scientific method instead of being blind believers?
Again, it comes back to telling the truth and sticking to it, and also organising around it, around profound ideas, and letting the consequences of not making the decisions necessary to make mankind's survival ensured hit them in the head. Now, we can only do what we can do. We can do and pour in as much of our time, effort and whatever telling the truth, publishing literature, leading the horse to water. But the proverbial is you can't make him drink. But we live in a world that has real consequences. We live in a world where the global financial disintegration is going to have incredibly important personal consequences for many, many people. So consequently, our organisation, and particularly even for young people, is the same thing. Tell the truth, provide the alternative, and just keep on doing it. Don't worry about how many bums on seats at any one particular time. If we ever did that in our organisation, we would have gone out of business. We just tell the truth. We get out the message as best as we can, and we try and get as many people to join us to do the same thing. And I think the other thing is you have to really look into Mr. LaRouche's work and discover the optimism that he has. Now, I've been some pretty heavy stuff tonight, and I've laid out some pretty, frightening scenarios for those that are listening. But Mr. LaRouche is the eternal optimist. And you figure out, how can that be, right? Because he always knows there's a potential for change in people. That's the thing about people, they can change. And under the mass strike conditions that we're in Australia, what is happening today isn't going to be the same as tomorrow. It's not going to be the same as the next time. We don't know where the next breakout is going to come. So from that point of view, what can we do? Tell the truth, don't deviate, don't worry about popular opinion, and just stand firm. And if people want to join us in that, we should welcome them with open arms, and don't worry about their foibles, just bring them in. Because we represent an optimistic movement for this country, as what I laid out with the development projects. We can do this. We can do this. The question is, do you want to? Do you think that we can beat the Crown? And that's why it requires some pretty serious thought about what I've sort of raised over the course of tonight, because these are new ideas for some. And it puts you guys, the ones that are both listening on the webcast, but in this audience tonight, on the mat. What are you going to do? Do more than you're doing today. And that'll be one good step forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Craig. I'd like to thank everyone tonight, both in our audience and those watching over the internet. And I urge all of you who are not already members of the CEC to visit our website, visit our online store and join us as a member, become a subscriber to one of our publications, and even more importantly, to become an activist with the CEC, which actually means becoming a part of the new leadership of this country. Through the course of this week, LaRouche described the fact that we are on the verge of a complete change in politics on a planetary scale, including the probable breakup of the British Empire, and Australia can play an incredible role in that. And it is very obvious from what Craig went through tonight, from the events in politics here in the recent weeks, of the likes we haven't seen for many decades in this country, that we have all of the elements of real politics taking shape in this country, with an awakened citizenry, but not just people waking up enraged, rallying against, their leaders, but a population that is being inspired with real ideas, with real leadership, being educated and being mobilised. And I'd like to end with the words of King O'Malley, again our founder of the Commonwealth Bank, because he foreshadowed that Australia could make a major shift worldwide. And he said that when Australians woke up, they'd wake up good and proper. Then let the rest of the world look this way. There'll be something to see, that I promise you. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.